Hi everyone, and welcome to our live cram session. This is our second one of these. This is for the ACT, and thank you so much for being here. It looks like we've got a few folks here already, like some folks are still rolling in. If you could do me a favor, if you're here right now, go ahead and comment in the chat. Let me know, can you see me? Can you hear me? And then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Okay, not hearing from anybody yet. If someone could just let me know, can you see me? Can you hear me? That would be awesome. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Erika. I am the Senior SAT and ACT Curriculum Manager here at Magoosh. If you want to know a little bit more about me, you can watch the Meet Erika video that we posted live on our channel a couple of weeks ago, a little bit more than a couple of weeks ago at this point. You should also see some new videos from me coming up soon. So if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, go ahead and do that. And you should see those videos in the next couple of weeks. Hi. Okay. Thank you so much, folks. Okay. So we have some folks here. Now, this live stream is going to be a Q&A session. So we're going to cram together and answer your guys' specific questions. So if you have questions loaded up, go ahead and throw those in the chat. So you can start doing that now. And while you guys do that, I want to do a quick little spiel about practice tests, which is the purpose of this cram session. So if you didn't stumble upon this by chance, so if you heard about this on our blog, or if you got an email from us or anything else like that, then you know that the big message of this live stream is to take a practice test this weekend, ideally before this stream, so you can ask your questions. And the big reason for that is that there are a lot of test dates coming up in October, quite a few, and over the next few months. Now, taking practice tests, especially a final practice test, so maybe the week or a couple of weeks before your exam, is really important. Practice tests are a great opportunity to apply everything that you've learned so far in your testing experience, not only to review all of it, but to apply it in a testing context, which is actually pretty different from a regular practice context. And in doing so, it allows you to also practice some of those strategies that you might not necessarily get to in normal practice. So things like time management, things like endurance, things like anxiety management, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have taken a practice test already, maybe this morning, awesome. This live stream is going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions about things that came up during your practice test, things that came up during your practice test review, anything of that nature. Now, if you have not had a chance to take a practice test yet, maybe you're sitting there going, I'm subscribed to the channel. I didn't know I was supposed to take a practice test. That's totally okay. You can still ask questions. But I would like to encourage you to take a final practice test before your test date. So that might be this weekend. If your test date is next weekend, might be a little bit later. If your test is far enough out, you might take a couple of practice tests between now and then. But I do really want to encourage you to do that. If you are a current Magoosh student, a really great way to do that is with your online exam in your Magoosh account. So that exam is going to be really awesome because it's going to take from the bank of Magoosh questions, and it's going to prioritize questions that you haven't seen yet. So that's going to give you the newest possible test experience and make that as realistic as possible. If you are not a current Magoosh student, maybe you're not a Magoosh student yet, then a really great way to do that is going to be to go to the description on this video. We've got a couple of full-length practice tests linked. One of those is an official exam from the ACT. One of those is another Magoosh practice test. That one is a PDF, so the questions are going to be consistent. So if you're a Magoosh student, might not be the best call for you because it might be a question. It might have some questions that you've already seen. So that's the story there. That's my spiel. Take a practice test. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We have some questions here already. Great. Okay, a couple of questions. I'm scared of this test and I barely know math. Yeah, this test, it can be a little bit overwhelming. It's a long test and there is a lot on it. So one of the best things that you can do is to start your study early. And to go in with kind of a plan of attack. So knowing when you're going to study each week, what you're going to cover, all that good stuff. Now, if you've got a slightly shorter timeline, then what I would recommend to you is making sure that you know what's going to be the most important thing for you on that test. So that's going to be partially due to what's going to be on the exam. So what topics show up more frequently than others. So for math, things like algebra are going to show up quite a bit. Things like trig going to show up maybe a little bit less. Things like matrices, you're probably only going to see one problem, so it might not be the highest priority for you. But that's also going to have to do with what you need. So if you have a lot of strength in geometry, that's probably not what you're going to study. You're probably going to study the stuff that is going to be more useful for you, stuff that you can learn, but that you're currently not as great at. Similarly, there are some strategies that'll really help you. Time management is going to be really, really useful. Prioritizing the questions that you can get right efficiently, deprioritizing the questions that are going to be harder, that you're maybe not even going to finish. Just saying, I'm not going to waste my time with those. That can be really useful and really empowering, specifically on the math section, but on all the sections altogether. So if you are afraid of this test, yep, that's pretty normal. It is kind of scary, and the fact that it plays a pretty big role and it's hyped a lot in your high school experience, that plays a role as well. Having a tool to help you study, whether that's a book or a course like Magoosh's course, can also help, because that ensures that you have access to everything that you need to know for the test, and that you're not trying to figure that out on your own. So that's another option for you. But I do want to go ahead and say this is for ACT only. If you do have a question for SAT, feel free to throw it in there, just because some SAT questions do translate to ACT questions as well. Sometimes the advice is very, very similar. So I might be able to give you some advice there, but if it's too off focus, probably won't. Okay, what else do we have? Do we have to pay for the practice test? No, so the ones that are linked in the description below, those are totally 100% freebie. So that includes the official one that's linked. That also includes the Magoosh PDF. The one that I talked about for Magoosh students, the one that generates a practice test based on questions that they haven't seen yet, that is in our premium account. So that would be something you would pay for, but there are free options linked below. There are also some other free practice tests online. A little bit of Googling will help you find this. I specifically recommend taking official ones if you're looking for those, just because there are quite a few out there. Just make sure that you don't take ones that are super old, because the test has changed a little bit since then. And know that if you're taking a test from before, I believe 2016, maybe 2015, the essay will be different. So if you are trying to practice the essay, make sure it's a recent exam. And that's specifically for ACT, a little bit different for SAT. And your questions are over here. That's why I'm looking off to the side. Okay, hi. All right, what else have we got? Most common style of math question. So in general, for the ACT and the SAT as well, probably the math skill that is going to be the most common across the questions is going to be algebra. There is harder math. There's actually kind of more challenging math on the ACT than there is on the SAT. So things like get into logarithms a little bit, get into matrices, complex numbers, and that's scary for a lot of students. Little bit of weird trig in there as well, that doesn't really get covered on the SAT. But that's not the primary stuff covered on that test. There really isn't a ton of that. What you're primarily going to see on this test is going to be algebra, and the stuff that isn't algebra, like geometry, that's going to have algebra as kind of a basis, because geometry is just algebra with shapes. There's also going to be word problems. Those word problems, again, have an algebra basis typically. There's also going to be some arithmetic stuff in there, like percents are going to be a really important arithmetic concept. But I would say primarily you're going to be looking at algebra concepts. So those are the sorts of things to review, especially if you haven't seen that recently. I know a lot of folks who are in like advanced math in high school, they're like, this is going to be a breeze. That might be true, but it also might be, hey, I haven't seen this in a little while and I need to do a bit of review. So if you haven't taken a practice test like at all, that's a really great thing to do, just to kind of get a feel for, hey, what's on this test? What do I need to study? What am I stronger at? What am I weaker at? So that you can start prioritizing your study accordingly. So if you have not taken a test at all, doing a test as kind of almost a diagnostic is a really great way to figure out what's going on in general. I also recommend checking out our Magoosh blog. We have a lot of great articles there about like what you can expect from ACT and what you can expect from specifically the math section. So you might be able to get your questions answered there. Okay. Tips for the geometry part of the math section. Jay, I can help you out. My number one tip for geometry is to draw. And it seems like pretty obvious, but yes, you should absolutely draw. If you are given a figure, you can draw on top of that figure. If you're not given a figure, you should draw a figure. And this applies to like standard geometry, either 2D or 3D, but it also applies to coordinate geometry, so stuff on an XY plane. Drawing is the best way to visualize things and to make sure that you don't get lost in kind of the convoluted mess of the problem. Other than that, as you are drawing, label everything, write things on your paper. It is super, super easy to get lost in there. Similarly, writing down the equations, important. I see a lot of folks like mis-squaring something in geometry. And it's just really unfortunate because that is such a classic mistake that the test makers are going to build in wrong answers that take advantage of that, where you did all your math right, but then you just didn't square the radius or whatever, which is a huge bummer. So write things down, label things. Those are some of my big recommendations for geometry. If you're having trouble with the formulas, yeah, I get that. What I recommend is first knowing what formulas you have to know and knowing which formulas you don't have to know, because you don't have to know everything. And then second, try to think about the logic behind those formulas. For instance, with quadrilaterals, right? Pretty much every quadrilateral area formula is base times height. It's just a different version of base times height. So with the square, it's the base and the height, but the base and the height are the same. So that's where you get side squared. With rectangle, it's base times height. With a parallelogram, it's base times height, but the height is always at a right angle, so it's not going to be the side. You're going to have to draw in the height. So it's base times height again. Trapezoid is where it gets a little bit weird because you have two bases, so you take the average of the bases and you multiply by the height. It's the same formula, right? So that can help you memorize like 4 different formulas in one. Similarly with like 3D figures, it's just the area of the base times the height, like consistently across the board. That's true for rectangular prisms, triangular prisms, cylinders. So thinking about the logic behind those formulas can make them a lot easier to memorize. And that's something I actually recommend across the board, even outside of geometry. So those are my big suggestions for geometry. Draw, label, think about the logic. All right. Okay, for the science section, should I read the passage first or should I jump straight into the questions? That's a really great question, Rabav. My recommendation is actually like kind of between there, which is to skim the passage first. Now, skimming is kind of the same thing we're going to do in reading, which is basically first, skimming is not speed reading. A lot of people think, hey, I'm going to read every single word really, really fast. No, that's not what I'm talking about. When we skim, we're trying to get the big idea from every chunk of text, so maybe a paragraph, maybe a diagram, whatever. We're going to try to get the big idea and then skip all the stuff that's extra. So there we might be reading like first and last sentences. We might be reading sentences with transition words, but we're probably skipping things like long definitions, long explanations. When we look at like a figure, we're going to try to look at the trends, but we're not going to get super hung up on like the individual pieces of data. So we might go, okay, it increases as we go down the table. We might draw a little arrow to show that it increases, things like that. And we're going to do that quickly, but that's just going to give us like a big idea of what's going on. So if we've got conflicting viewpoints, we might be like, okay, this guy likes X. This guy does not like X. They like Y. And then this guy says, okay, neither X nor Y is quite right. They actually like Z. We don't really need to have a great feel for what X, Y, and Z are. We just need to know more of the relationship. So the big idea is how things interplay. So that's what I recommend first. I do not recommend going to the questions immediately because we're not going to know how to answer them. A lot of people go, hey, I can always come back and find it. And that's totally true. You know, when it comes to skimming, oftentimes we're not getting details. We're going to have to come back and find those details. But when we have skimmed, we at least have a good idea of where those details will be. So we'll go like, okay, I saw that was in the second diagram, right? Or like, hey, I saw that was in the second half of the first paragraph, right? So then we can find it more easily. If we haven't even looked at the passage, we're just going to end up kind of reading it to find that detail. We're going to have kind of a hard time with that. So recommendation for science, but also for reading, is to give your passage a skim, looking for big ideas, looking for relationships. And that might be relationships, again, between different viewpoints, relationships between multiple passages, relationships between the text and graphs. And then after that, going to the questions and then going back to the text as needed to answer. You'll find that it's much easier to find things if you have that kind of big overview. Be careful though. A lot of people will then take this as an opportunity to read the whole thing. You're probably not going to have time to do that. I know I never did, to read every single word and totally process that passage before going to the questions. You're not going to fully get it, and that's okay. You're not supposed to. Hopefully that answers your questions. If you have more questions on that, feel free to throw those in the chat. Okay. Any reading tips? That was kind of my big one that I just gave for science. The idea that we're not going to jump straight to the questions, because then we end up like rereading a lot of stuff. And also we often end up missing the question because the test makers are going to throw in trap answers, things that look right or things that are assumptions that seem reasonable or that show up in other parts of the passage or that are just like one word off, right? It's going to be very easy to fall for those if we're just kind of like searching randomly for the answer. So doing a little skim first, then going to the questions for anything that isn't a broader question, anything that's more specific. So maybe we skipped over that fluff as we were reading, go back, hunt it down. And that leads me to kind of my second tip for reading, which is know how to do process of elimination for reading, because a lot of people do it wrong. A lot of people think process of elimination is I read the question, then I read the answers, and then I look for the one that looks right. No, that's a desperation strategy. Because as I just mentioned, those answers are traps, right? If we read them, if we give them space in our brain, we start to consider them, right? And then that test, the trap that the test maker set for us, we're falling right into it. So what we're going to do instead, unless we're totally desperate, unless we have no idea what's going on in the question, is we're going to ignore the answer choices and then predict an answer. Because this test, the vast majority of students would do better if it was like a fill in the blank or a free response, because that forces us to go, okay, let me figure it out for myself. Now, once you've made a prediction, and it might not be a perfect prediction, it might be like the author likes it, or the author doesn't like it, or the author has mixed feelings, right? Something like that. Then we can go to those answer choices and compare it back to our prediction. And because we have that path in our mind, that prediction, that idea, it's going to be a lot easier to avoid those trap answers. Hopefully that helps. So those are kind of my big two strategies. Don't read it, but don't skip straight to the answers. Skim. And then, okay, once we read the question, try not to read the answers. Try to come up with your own prediction, then rule out the answers or pick the answer based on that prediction. Cool. All right. Should we take the essay? Great question. In most cases, I'm going to recommend yes. And the reason for that is that that's going to provide you the most flexibility. It's really unfortunate when students are like, okay, I have my college list. None of my schools require the essay, so I'm not going to take it. And then last minute, they're like, oh, I really want to apply to this other school, or I want to apply to this scholarship, and that school or that scholarship requires the essay. Oh, so now they have to go back and take the test again, right? That's not ideal. So what I recommend is taking the essay. It's a little bit extra time. It's a little bit inconvenient, but it's not going to hurt you. If the school doesn't require the essay really isn't going to get you into trouble, right? So try it, do your best. Essays in general are relatively easy to game as long as you know the approximate structure of that essay. Throw in enough transition words, make sure you have intro sentences, make sure you have a thesis and a conclusion, and that your thesis and conclusion have the right stuff in it. As long as you know the general structure of the essay and execute on that, then you should get a decent score. And then you have that flexibility later. If you do need the essay, you have it. If you're going, I don't know if my schools require the essay, or I don't have a finalized college list yet, then you should definitely take the essay, again, just to provide that flexibility so you don't lock yourself in to only applying to schools or scholarships that do not require the essay. Cool. All right. Okay, so if you want to take the SAT, then this is probably not the live stream for you because this one is specifically focused on the ACT exams, just because there are so many of those this month. If you are taking the SAT exam, there's some chance we're going to be doing an SAT, one of these cram sessions, so keep an eye out for that, subscribe to our channel, all that good stuff. Similarly, there are a bunch of Magoosh resources for the SAT. We have an SAT program, just like our ACT program, with practice tests, with practice questions, with lessons, explanations, video lessons, written explanations, video explanations, all that good stuff. So recommend you check that out. There is a 7-day free trial if you want to try that. We also have our high school blog, which has both SAT and ACT content. So recommend you check that out. Again, if you have more general questions that you think might also apply to the ACT, you can ask those here and I can answer those. But if you have things like very specific to the SAT, probably not the right live stream for you. All right. Okay, and if folks have more questions, just throw those in there because I'm just going in order. So please do ask questions. This is your opportunity to ask what you need. So go for it. All right. Thomas says, if I get to a math question and I'm not 100% sure about the method, is it worth my time to just skip it or should I take the time to do it? Great question. Simple answer in general, I advocate skipping and coming back if you are like, what's happening? That's the kind of short answer. Yes, skip, mark it so that you know to come back at the end. More complicated answer is it depends a little bit on how you're doing with time. If you are behind time, yeah, circle that sucker, come back later. There's a decent chance if you're looking at that and you're like, what? You're just going to spend way too much time, probably get it wrong, and then be even more behind than you were. So yes, if you're behind time, circle that, move on. If you're on time or ahead of time, what I recommend is giving yourself like 15, 20 seconds, maybe even 30 seconds. It's just kind of going, okay, let me read the problem, maybe start interpreting it, see if there's something going on here that maybe wasn't apparent on the surface. Because oftentimes when folks are confused on questions, it's because they look at it and it's like really long or because it looks really scary because it's like a function or a sequence and it's like, right? You look at it and it looks awful. But if you spend a little bit of time with it, you're like, oh, yeah, right? You like plug in a couple of numbers and then it makes complete sense. Or you go, okay, this was really scary, but actually they just gave me the formula and I just plug and chug. That's really common actually toward the end of the section where they give you these long, awful problems that really aren't that bad once you get into them. So I digress. If you are doing okay on time, or even if you're ahead of time, might be worth giving it a little bit of time to go, am I really actually confused on this? Because it might just be that the test maker is trying to scare me. Now, if you've spent a little bit of time with it, like you've gotten to the end of the question, you've done stuff with the information, you know what it's asking for, you know what you're being given, and you're still like, what is happening? Or you don't know what you're being asked for or what you're being given. Yeah, circle that, come back. If you're in a situation where you got pretty far, like it's not A or B or C, but it's either D or E, great. Make a note of that on your paper so that, again, when you are at the very end of the test, you can like bubble in one of your guesses and you don't bubble in A, B, or C, right? So mark that. I like to do it lightly on my bubble sheet. So just like gently cross them out, or gently next to the number, just write in like D, E. So like very lightly, so that at the end of the test, I can bubble in D or E and then just quickly erase that, because it's so light. It's really easy to erase, and then I'm guaranteed that the scanner isn't going to pick it up. So those are my recommendations there. Yes, in general, I think skipping is a great idea. Just make sure that you have time to come back at the end to at least put in a random guess, because random guessing does not hurt you. Not guessing is, you're guaranteed to not get the point. With guessing, you have at least a 20% chance of getting it. So make sure that you have time at the end to come back and guess. If you can narrow it down further, do. But in general, especially if you're finding that you have a hard time with time management on this section, skipping is a really powerful strategy to allow you to get to the questions that you have the most chance of getting right. Cool. Every question is worth the same number of points. That is really useful to think. So if it's easy for you, worth the same number of points as something that's really hard for you. So don't waste your time on the stuff that's hard for you that you're probably going to get wrong. All right. Is there a cheat sheet for all the formulas I need to know for the math section? Absolutely. Now, it's not going to be given to you on the test. That is something that's really important to know, is that the ACT and the SAT are different. The SAT has this beautiful formula sheet that you get to use on your test day. Not so for the ACT, unfortunate. But there are plenty of resources with those formulas out there. I am near positive we have one of those on our blog. So if you Google ACT formulas or ACT formula sheet Magoosh, that should come up. Near positive we have one of those. If you can't find that, there are sheets out there from other test prep companies. But yes, that exists. I would recommend checking a couple out, just because some resources are outdated. Some resources are incomplete, just to make sure that you are getting like the complete picture. So yes, that exists. Just give it a Google. It should be relatively easy to find. But you will have to memorize those formulas for test day. Kind of a bummer. Again, think about the logic behind them. That's going to make them easier to memorize than if you're just trying to like cram them into your brain without understanding them. Okay. What are the common strategies for the ACT reading section? Actually covered that a little bit earlier. Quick recap, those strategies were to skim the passage rather than reading it fully word for word or skipping straight to the question. It's kind of intermediate. We're trying to pick up on relationships and big ideas from that passage. A good way to tell if you've got a good feel for that is at the end of every paragraph, if you can summarize what that paragraph was about, like what was the point of that paragraph, what was the author trying to tell you in like 5 words, and you got it, you're good. Then second strategy, when you go to the questions, try to predict an answer rather than looking at the answer choices, because those answer choices are traps. So don't let yourself get sucked down whatever line of reasoning the test maker is trying to pull you into. They know how we think, right? That's their job. So they have built those traps in because they are convincing. So ignore them. It's a minefield. Don't look at it. Figure out what you are looking for. Then go to those answer choices. Those are kind of my big strategies. If you want more detail on that, you can rewind a little bit. I talked about it toward the beginning. Third strategy, just for fun, since we're already here, you don't have to do the passages in order. So just like you can skip questions in the math section, you can also skip questions on reading, but I also recommend skipping passages. Now, that's not to say you're going to not do that passage. Ideally, we're going to get to all of the passages. That might not be the case for you, depending on what your score goals are. If you're really, really struggling with timing, you might be doing some different prioritization. But in general, kind of across the board, if you are really not strong with a certain passage type, don't start there. If the first type of passage is not a type of passage that you feel super comfortable with, don't start there. Go ahead and do a different type of passage, right? So do the type of passage that you can go through quickly, that makes you feel good, that makes you feel confident, that you know you're going to do well with, and then we can work our way in the other direction. And the goal there is, again, that we're dealing with the stuff that's harder for us, the stuff that we're less likely to finish toward the end. So if we lose those points, we were probably going to lose them anyway. It also puts us in kind of a better like mental and emotional place going into the section, and that we're not immediately kind of beaten down by the test. So that's kind of a third strategy for reading, is start with a passage type you're comfortable with. The passages always go in the same order of types. So take a look at an official exam, see what that is. It's also the same in the Magoosh exam, so you can look there, and then kind of feel out your strategy. If there isn't a passage type that's stronger or weaker for you, then you can just go in order, but remember that you can't skip it. Okay. It is just so hard to keep up with time on the reading section, so what would you recommend to do for this? Yeah, I'm with ya. Different people struggle with timing on different sections. For me, I struggle with the timing on the math and the science. Those are the ones for me that, those are hard. Those are ones where I have to use that skipping strategy more frequently. If for you that's reading, then that's kind of what I recommend is taking advantage of that skipping strategy. Don't let yourself get way too sucked in to an individual question. If it's driving you nuts, if it's not working, circle it, come back later. Often with fresh eyes, it'll make a lot more sense. Second strategy there, often I find when people are really struggling with time on the reading, it's because they're either reading every single word of the reading passage, not advisable, or skipping straight to the questions and then going and hunting for every single answer, which you end up reading the passage like 3 times when you do that. And you often end up missing questions. So if you are really struggling with your timing, consider like, am I implementing that skimming strategy effectively? And if not, that's something to practice. Maybe start by practicing it untimed so you can kind of just get a feel for what am I looking for? So often that's, again, first and last sentences, special emphasis on first and last paragraphs, sentences with transition words, anything that's like data or an also or a similarly or first, second, third, fourth, not important. Don't bother with that. Right? That's all detail. That's fluff. That's stuff you've already heard, but just getting into more detail. Now, true questions might ask about that, but if you've done that general skim, you can go, hey, I remember that was from the topic that was in paragraph 3, and you can go back and find it later. So consider, am I doing that skimming strategy, or am I really reading every single word, or am I not even getting a good feel for what each paragraph is doing? Okay, right? So think about your strategy there. That might also help you. Oh, and if you're spending a lot of time with the answer choices, like really can't decide between B and C, so you're just kind of like staring at them and reading them over and over and over again. 1, maybe circle it and come back. But 2, go back to your prediction. Go, what was my prediction? Okay, which answer choice is closest to my prediction? Pick that one. Move on. Just be done. Trust yourself more than the answer choices. If you find yourself being pulled away from your prediction or like pulled into a detail or into a sentence that you don't really understand, that is the test maker pulling you into a trap. Nope, don't do it. Don't fall for it, right? Be strong, stay with your strategies. So those are my big recommendations for reading. It takes time to get this right. The strategy on the reading section is tricky and very like big picture. Oftentimes strategy for something like math is more kind of like individual question based, but reading strategy is big picture stuff. So take the time to practice that, practice it both untimed and then timed later. Be patient with yourself. And again, if you are really, really struggling, do the stuff that you're good at first, save the stuff that's more difficult for later. Okay. Yeah, if you are a slow reader, big recommendation, don't read everything. Don't do it. All the stuff that's detail, you don't have to read it. It's not important. And if there are a couple of questions that ask for it, okay, at least know where to go back to, right? So you can go, okay, that idea was in the third paragraph. And then you can look for the specific words in the question. You found it quickly. So if you're a slow reader, try to read less. Pick up on the big ideas. A good strategy there is to think about, if you were writing an essay, which sentences would be the most important, which paragraphs would be the most important. So typically first and last paragraphs, first and last sentence of each paragraph, and any strong transition words like however, but, like contrast words, as well as conclusion words like therefore, as a result. And then anything with strong language, typically a good bet. Anything that's detail-y, dates, percents, data, quotes, don't bother with it. Detailed explanations, don't need it. All right. For the math section, do you think it's better to guess an answer or just skip it entirely if you're not sure of the answer, which you think is better to get more points? Okay. Ooh, a little blurry. Gonna see if we can get that back. Okay. Oop, give me 1 sec. Okay, better. By the end of the section, you should have a guess in for every single question. Skipping a question, you are guaranteed to not get the point. If you guess, guessing wrong does not hurt you. You do not lose points. And you have a chance that you guessed right, especially if you've eliminated some answers. So never, ever, 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 ever leave a question blank. Make sure if you are low on time, don't keep going. Don't try to like do a question right. Just bubble in everything randomly if you have to, because that gives you a better chance of getting more points. So that's where I want to start. But second point, if you are looking at a problem like halfway through the section, beginning of the section, whatever, and you go, I have no idea what's going on. Typically I don't. And there's different opinions on this, but I personally don't recommend immediately bubbling in an answer, because if you do have time later, you're going to go back and have to erase it, which just takes time and it can mess up the scanner and it's not great. So what I typically recommend is circling it and then just saving time to come back later. Now, if you've done the problem and you're like pretty sure it's an answer, but you're like, it might be this other one, there you might fill in the answer you think it is. But again, just put a light little mark next to it so you can come back later and then just go, is it really that, or should I give this a little bit more thought? So it kind of depends. If you're like guessing blindly, I recommend bubbling it in at the end. If you think you have a pretty good guess, you can go ahead and guess now. But always, always, always keep an eye on the time. If you are low on time, make sure you go back and bubble in anything you skipped, even if it is randomly. So when I say skip, that never means leave it blank by the end of the section. It means maybe leave it blank for now, or bubble in your answer lightly, or like mark that it's D or E or whatever, but you're always going to bubble by the end of the section, always. And that's true for both the ACT and the SAT. Cool. Hopefully that makes sense. So guessing wrong will not hurt you, can only help you. All right. Any tips for the English section? Awesome. So the English section is the same as the writing section on the SAT, approximately. Basically, that's the section that deals with grammar, but also on kind of like the rhetorical function of writing. So does it do what it's trying to do, right? Does it accomplish the author's goals? Any tips there? Let me think. This is passage-based. This is kind of a straightforward tip. A lot of people think, not a lot of people, some people think that it's going to be similar to the reading, where you're going to read through it and then go to the questions. Don't do that. Do the questions as you come to them. These are a lot less based on the passage as a whole, so we're just going to kind of do it as we reach the question. Typically, the question is going to rely on stuff outside of, if there's an underlined portion, the underlined portion. It's going to typically rely on the sentence if it's grammatical. If it's kind of a more rhetorical question, so like stuff about transition words or stuff about like, should we add or delete a sentence, then it might rely on multiple sentences. So for writing, do it as you come to it. And then we're going to look at a window kind of outside of the question, typically of like one sentence, maybe of a couple sentences. Other tip here, this is a section where I don't find it depends. Where prediction may or may not be helpful depending on the type of question. So if it's a grammatical question like punctuation, right, or related to modifiers or parallelism or whatever. If it's a grammatical question, typically I don't find it super useful to predict. What I find it useful to do is to go, what type of question is this? Try to define what rule, what grammatical thing you're working with. Then just go through the answer choices and find the right one. If you're dealing with a more rhetorical question, so transition word, should I put the sentence in? Should I reorder these sentences? Where should this go? Does this, meet the author's goals? Those sorts of questions. There, it is a good idea to predict, because those are more like reading questions in disguise. They're just reading questions that they've weaseled in to the writing section, basically. So what we're going to do there is, once we've identified that this is not a grammatical question, typically if there's like a question stem, so it's not just an underlined portion and then like no change, B, C, D, whatever, then we'll go, okay, maybe I'm going to try to make my own prediction for where do I think it should go, or would I keep this sentence or delete it, or like what type of transition word would I put in here based on the relationship between these sentences, and then that can help you with your answer choices. So kind of the big takeaway there is, when you're going to a question, try to figure out what type of question it is. If there isn't a question stem, you'll look at the answer choices and go, what do I see is going on here? Oh, is there a period in this one and a semicolon in this one and a colon in this one and a comma in this one? That's punctuation, right? Do I see some apostrophe S's? That is going to be possessives, right? So try to figure out what's going on. If you're going, okay, yeah, there's a chunk at the beginning, that's probably going to be rhetorical, and then use that to help you approach. So then kind of the second portion there is know what things are tested on the section. Really great way to do that. Take a practice test. And if you're going, I don't really know, like it just feels like that's wrong. Okay, then we don't really know the rule there. That would be a great opportunity to look up the question, like maybe give it a Google. Or if we have something like a Magoosh program, to go, okay, let me look at what lesson this is in, or look at the related lessons, look at the explanation to go, why is this actually wrong? A lot of students are relying on their ear for the English section. Sometimes that works, but not always, because oftentimes the test maker will build in things that sound good but aren't actually good, or will build in things that fit the rules but have a messed up meaning, right? So making sure that you know what is tested, what those rules are, so that you can trust those rules and trust meaning beyond just, does that sound okay to me? Does that look right? Is going to help you a lot on this section. Cool. Hopefully that helps. Will the live stream be saved for us to come back to watch? I may need to leave for a bit. Yep, it will. It's going to take a little bit to upload because that's how live streams work. So it won't be immediately available. You might need to come back tonight. But yes, it will be saved. Obviously, I won't be live anymore. So if you have questions, I won't be able to answer those. That's how live streams work. But if you do have other questions later, you can feel free to leave those in the comments below, and someone from our team will hopefully be able to get back to you. All right. Also, if you are a Magoosh ACT student and you're going, hey, I got to go, but I got questions, or if by the end of this you're going, I've still got questions, you can use that little help button in the bottom of your Magoosh account to ask a question to our student help team. They are awesome. They're so great. This is really, like, I think one of the things that makes Magoosh so special is that you guys have access to this if you have an account. So ask a question to the student help team. They'll respond. They're really great, and they can help you out with that. So if you don't get around to your question here and you are a Magoosh student, you'll have another opportunity. If you aren't a Magoosh student, try leaving it in the comments. All right. Is the test computer-based? That is a great question, Rabav. Okay. Looks like we're not fuzzy anymore. Generally, no. Generally, the ACT is going to be paper-based. That said, sometimes schools will do computer-based administrations. I'm not 100% sure about this, but it's also possible if you are international, if you are an international student, so not in the US, that it's more likely that you'll get a computer-based test as well, but I'm not entirely sure. So on occasion, it is delivered in a computer-based format, but that's typically going to be a test that's administered by your school, so like typically on a weekday. Now, that's not to say if you're taking a weekday test that will be computer-based. That's actually pretty uncommon. If you are taking a test with your school, ask someone. Typically, you should know, but I have had students surprised in the past who prepared for a paper-based test and then come back and then been like, surprise, it was on a computer. It's the same test if it is computer-based, but the strategies will be slightly different. So like, for instance, you won't be able to mark up a passage as you're reading through it, or like write summaries in the margins. If you have a diagram for, say, a geometry question, you won't be able to write on it. You'll have to draw that on your own paper. So that is a little bit different. So if you are taking an exam with your school, just be sure that it's not a computer-based test. It probably won't be. If you are taking like a normal Saturday administration or a Sunday administration, because there is one of those coming up, should not be computer-based. If you are not in the US, I'm not 100% sure. Just check in with your testing center. All right. Sometimes I try to skim over the passage, but by the time I reach to the questions, I forget a little bit of the information, and it's hard to see which part the question is asked from, so what to do. Recommendation there, take a little bit of notes. Now, that's not to say take notes while you read, because then people take way too many notes. At the end of every paragraph, stop and go, what was the point of that paragraph? Come up with it in 5 words and write that down. That's it. That's the whole thing. So then when you go to the question and you read the question stem, you can go, okay, that idea, what summary is that idea closest to? Similarly, because you took the time to write that down, because you took the time to process it well enough to get it into 5 words, you're going to remember it a lot better for when you go to the question. Taking time to jot things down is a huge strategy. I really recommend that. That's actually something I recommend on the math section, is when you're reading, do something like circling the thing you're solving for. So if it's x plus y, circle x plus y. Or if you're going, okay, it's the reciprocal, so it's -1/m, circle that. So having that written down or circled or whatever on your paper is going to make it much more likely it's going to stick in your head so that you don't accidentally solve for something else. So big recommendation, jot stuff down. Just do not write too many notes, because that can take way too much time. A lot of people are scared that jotting down notes is going to like eat a ton of time. It's 5 words per paragraph, maybe even less. Not going to take a whole ton of time. The thinking part can take a little bit of time, but if you're really going, hey, I'm at the end of the paragraph and I have no idea what that was about, maybe we didn't read it very effectively. So maybe we spent too much time with stuff that wasn't important. Maybe we want to read actually less of it, but focus on like the first sentence more than anything. So that's a really big recommendation there. Read less, understand more. And a great way to understand is to jot down little summaries at the end of every paragraph. Very short. All right. Rohit says, any ways to improve the English section score? Great question. It depends a little bit on where you're at. If you are on your English section not finishing, my recommendation would be practice your skipping strategy, so that you can skip the questions that are taking a ton of time for you and focus on the questions that are easier. That's probably going to like automatically raise your score, because you're going to be spending your time with the questions you're more likely to get right. Additional things, the English section I think is one of the more straightforward sections on the test, in that it's one of those sections where knowing the rules is going to be really helpful with getting the points. So be honest with yourself and go, when I answer this question, do I think, oh, it's because things in a list need to be parallel to each other? Or do I go, that sounds right? If you're going, that sounds right, it means you don't really know the rule. So that is a case where you should seek out that rule. You should try to figure out, why is that wrong? Why is that right? Even if you get the question right, because if you're just going, it sounds good versus it sounds bad, that means that next time, if you can't tell if it sounds good or sounds bad, you won't have that rule to back you up. You won't have that reasoning to back you up. So my big recommendation for improving your English score is really being honest with yourself. Do I know the rules, or am I trusting my ear? If you're trusting your ear, then often you might see score fluctuations, right? Maybe you'll do really well on one, really not great on another. Knowing those rules is a great way to make sure that your score stays roughly consistent and increases in the long run. All right. Most common grammar question type. Great question. I'm not sure I know. What is the most common grammar question type? I can list some of the most common ones. Things that are targeted a lot have to do with sentence structure. So is this a sentence? Or is it a fragment? Or is it a run-on? That's pretty common. Also pretty common has to do with verbs. So there's two things we can do with verbs: the tense as well as the number. So is the tense correct? So is the time correct? Does it match up with other tenses in the sentence? Or sometimes it doesn't match. Does it create a logical timeline? And then second, do I have a plural subject? If I've got a plural subject, I need a plural verb. Do I have a singular subject? If I've got a singular subject, I need a singular verb. What else? Punctuation fits in really nicely into sentence structure. Punctuation is there to create complete sentences versus incomplete sentences. There are other types of punctuation as well, like possessives, slightly less common. There are quite a few meaning-based questions. So those will be more along the lines of transition words, reordering sentences, adding or deleting sentences. Those are options where the grammar is correct, with choosing something that fits the tone of the passage or that fits the meaning of the passage. Again, not going to be grammatically incorrect. That's going to be meaning-based. So those are quite common, but again, that's not a grammar rule. So those are going to be a little bit more tricky. As for other grammar rules, parallelism fits in with verb, tense, and number, and sentence structure. I'm trying to think of other things that are quite common, but I would say that verbs are a big one. Sentence structure is a big one. Those are ones that I see quite a bit. Yeah, you'll also see agreement with pronouns. So singular nouns go with singular pronouns, plural nouns go with plural pronouns. That's something you'll see pretty regularly as well. Cool. So hopefully that answered your question. The big thing that I want to shout out that's kind of away from your question is that there are questions on the English section, quite a few, that are not grammar-based, that are meaning-based. So just make sure that you're ready for those as well. Often those will have a question stem before the answer choices. So just if you see that, be aware. Sometimes it won't have a question stem, but if it's like transition words, that's also going to be meaning-based. So not everything on the English section is grammar-based. Okay. How much do we have to pay for the Magoosh account? Great question. So first, there's a free trial, a 7-day free trial. So I recommend doing that. Especially if you're looking at a pretty brief timeline before your test, you can get a lot done with a free trial. So I recommend trying it out, even if you have a longer timeline, just to see if it works for you, to see if you like it, to see if any of the stuff that isn't in the free trial account that you would like that in the long term. Beyond that, how much you pay for your Magoosh account depends on how long you want it for. So there's a month option, there's a 3-month option, there's a year option. Let me go ahead and just pull up those prices right now. Oh, if my computer will let me. Okay, let me go ahead and pull those up really quickly so I can give those to you live. But you can also do exactly what I'm doing, which is pulling up just Googling ACT Magoosh. Oh, I gotta log out of my account. Oh, dang it. Give me like 2 seconds and then I can tell you. All right, Magoosh. All right, explore our plans. So you'll get to that page, you'll see explore our plans. So right now, the 1 month prep is going for $79. The 3 month plan is going for $89. That's at kind of a big discount because again, if you multiply 79 by 3, that's a lot more. So you can save a lot of money if you've got a longer timeline. And then if you're doing a year plan, you can save even more money because that's only $99. So 79 for 1 month, 89 for 3 months, 99 for 12 months. And in addition to coming with that full account, so that's going to be video lessons, that's going to be practice quizzes, that's going to be additional practice that you can customize to your own needs, in addition to practice tests, in addition to other resources, blah, blah, blah. You're also going to have access to our student help, which means you can ask questions at any time to our student help team and they'll answer them. So it's really awesome to have that. Again, there's a 7-day free trial. So if you're not like sure, you don't really know, or if you're a week out from your test or 2 weeks out from your test, you can give that a shot and either get some mileage out of it and not get an account or decide that you do want to get an account long term. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. How would one improve their science score? Great question, Suzanne. Couple of thoughts here. Again, this is like personally, I really struggled with the timing on the science section. So that's immediately where I go. If you don't struggle with timing on the science section, then this tip isn't super relevant to you. But if you are struggling with timing on the science section, like to the point where you're not finishing, or you just feel out of control the whole section, then I would really recommend working on that skimming strategy. So spending like 30 seconds to a minute, just getting big ideas from the passage, getting like a quick summary of each paragraph, getting a quick summary of each little diagram, getting trends, big thoughts before you go into those questions. I would also really recommend working on prediction. Prediction is very, very helpful for those science questions, again, so you don't get trapped in the answer choices. I would just note that there aren't a ton of questions for those passages. So if you are really just reading every word and just like striving to understand that passage at its core, don't, it's not worth it because they're not going to ask everything about the passage. And in fact, they're not going to get super into depth. They might ask about one detail, but you can go back, you can find it as long as you know where it is, right? So that's one thing that I would really practice is to try not to spend too much time with the passage before you go into the questions. Just look for big ideas. Second, I would recommend figuring out which passage types you're good at, which passage types you're not so great at. One that a lot of people struggle with is conflicting viewpoints. There's only one of those. If you really don't like those, save it for last. Again, they're worth the same number of points. It could affect like those little mini subsection scores. Those don't really matter. No one really looks at those. So don't bother with it. Just prioritize the questions that are going to be easier for you. In addition to that, one other quick tip for skimming those passages, and I kind of hinted at this earlier, because you don't really need to know what things are, you can almost think about them as a variable, right? So if your passage is talking about protoplanetary disks, okay, I don't know what that is. Just call it X, right? Okay, so scientist A learned something about X. In fact, they had a theory about X, but then scientist B said, scientist A, your theory is ridiculous. Actually, there's a different theory. And then the whole scientific community laughs scientist A out of town. So scientist B's theory is held as the truth for a long time, and then scientist C with new technology Y actually learns that maybe there was some validity to scientist A's theory, and the results of that experiment are below. Cool. Do I know what X is? No. Do I know scientist A or B's theory? No. Do I know what technology Y is? No. It doesn't matter. I don't have to know, right? If I can look at that table and go, okay, cool, I see that this increases, which aligns, I guess, with scientist A's theory. Great. That's really all we need to know. So don't get wrapped up in the details, in the definitions, in the explanations. Focus on those relationships, and that's going to help you a lot more. The questions are more about relationships than anything, and if they do get into the details, those details are usually relatively easy to find. There are going to be some questions that are just going to be hard. Skip it, come back, or eliminate a couple answers if you can and guess from the remaining ones. There are going to be some science questions that are just literally about science, and if you don't know it from your science class, you won't know it. There aren't a ton of those. If you see something and you're like, that wasn't in the passage, make a guess, move on, don't agonize. So that's kind of my big strategy for science. Don't agonize. You won't get everything right, probably. That's okay. You won't understand the passage fully. That is intentional. That's part of the goal of those passages. So give yourself a little bit more grace is my big recommendation. Be okay with not understanding everything. Be okay with skipping some questions. All right. I know that we are at time right now. I'm going to stick around a little bit longer to answer the remaining questions that I'm seeing. If you've got something that you are just dying to ask, feel free to throw that in the chat. But if you want to cruise, so glad that was helpful, Suzanne. If you want to cruise right now, again, you can come back and watch the last couple of minutes later if you want, or you can throw questions in those comments for later, or if you have a Magoosh account, you can ask student help. So if you are going to take off, see ya. Thanks so much for being here. If you haven't taken a practice test, please do. Those links are in the description. If you do want to stay, you do have any more questions, throw those in and I'll stick around. All right. Next question. Any advice on managing time on the different sections of the test from Carolina? Great question. Something I haven't mentioned yet, and I'm shocked that I haven't mentioned it yet because it's like my number one strategy, other than skipping questions and coming back later, is to have timing checkpoints. So for instance, on ACT Math, there are 60 questions, 60 minutes. So you have about 1 minute per question. Now, you're not going to look at the timer for every single question, or you're not going to look at the clock for every single question. That's not going to be great for you. It's really distracting. But what you might do is look at the clock every 10 questions, right? So after the 10th question, you can look at the clock and go, hey, am I around 10 minutes in? And if you're below that, great. That's awesome, especially because the section tends to start with easier questions and go to harder questions. So great if you're below. If you're over, okay, it's time for me to start maybe skipping some questions, start moving a little faster, right? And because we're checking that clock intermittently, we can kind of see where we're at. We don't get to a point where we're halfway through our time and we're like, oh no, I'm not even close to halfway through the section, because that can really put us in kind of a bad place. If you're especially concerned about the timing, you might check more frequently, like maybe every 5 questions on ACT Math. Now, for the other sections, those are passage-based. So you can check the time based on the passage. So for instance, with like ACT Science is either going to be 6 or 7 passages. It's 35 minutes. So you are looking at approximately 5 or 6 minutes per passage. Depends on how many you have. So that's going to be a really great way to just at the end of a passage be like, where am I? Am I about 5 to 6 minutes in? Great. If not, okay, I need to get moving. Cool. And then same deal with the reading and the English. There's always going to be the same number of passages in reading and in English. So you can take the number of passages, take the time per section, take that time per section, divide it by the number of passages, and get the amount of time you're going to spend on each passage approximately. And then again, just checking that clock to go, am I aligned with that? If you're not, let's get moving, maybe start skipping, maybe skim a little bit more on something like reading or science. So like read a little bit less. If you're ahead of time, cool. Maybe even I can slow my roll, maybe skip a little bit fewer questions, give it like an extra 10 seconds to try to interpret, things like that. So that's one of my best recommendations, is staying on the timing in a very intentional way. So not just like looking at the clock randomly. That's not helpful. That's in fact distracting. Know your checkpoints and use those to time yourself. Okay. Is less really more? Oh, I think. Oh, no, sorry. That is the question. Sorry, Thomas. I saw this one earlier, and I thought maybe I missed it. Is less really more in terms of sentence length questions? That's a tricky one, because concision is like really low on our list of priorities when it comes to to the English section and when it comes to grammar rules. General rule, if all of your remaining answers are grammatically correct and have the same meaning, the shorter one is typically better, not always. But where we get into trouble is that sometimes the shortest option is not grammatically correct or has a messed up meaning. So we need to be considering all of those things. So like top of our list is going to be meaning, but meaning's kind of tough, right? Sometimes meaning's a little harder. So often we start with grammar because grammar, the rules are straightforward. So we're going to look at grammar. We're going to eliminate anything that's not grammatically correct. Then we're going to go, okay, remaining answers, do they mean the same thing? Are they clear, right? Can I use a pronoun or do I need to repeat the noun because there are actually too many nouns in my sentence and I don't know what that pronoun refers to or whatever else, right? After that, if we go, okay, they're all grammatically correct, I'm sure of that, there's nothing I've missed, and they mean the same thing, go with the shortest one. That's it. Oftentimes, sentences that are more concise are correct because they aren't redundant. Sometimes it really is just, it's clearer to have it be shorter. Often there's like more complicated reasons for it. And if you are truly like beyond confused on a question, you have no idea what's happening, you don't know what grammar rule's happening, you're not entirely sure on the meaning either, you just really can't tell, picking the shortest one is often a good like desperation move to guess. But that is low on our priority list. That is low on our priority list. So that's the last step. So grammar, meaning, then like length, concision, awkwardness. That's not a rule. That's not a real thing. So save it for the very, very end, or if you are absolutely desperate. Cool. All right. How many hours would you recommend studying a day for significant score growth? It depends a little bit. It depends a little bit. I would recommend never doing a study session that's like shorter than 20 minutes. You're probably not going to get a lot of value out of that. But doing just 20-minute sessions isn't necessarily going to work, right? Because different types of study are going to take more time. So typically with a study session, like a really high quality study session, you're going to start out by doing a little bit of review from like a previous study session to be like, okay, what do I need to be thinking about today? What mistakes am I making? What have I learned? What do I need to carry into my study today? That's usually pretty quick. Then we go and we learn something. Then we go in and we apply it, we do it, right? So that's going to be doing some questions, right? Then we don't stop. We're not done here. This is where a lot of people make mistakes. They do the questions and they're like, cool, I got most of them right, I'm done. No, we go and we review. We go, okay, especially for the questions you got wrong. Why did I get those wrong? Let me make sure I understand. Is it the same reason I missed questions last time? Ooh, if so, that's a problem, right? So we're going to really review this. If we're in our Magoosh account, we'll take some notes on it so we can come back to it later. Maybe when we're looking at the beginning of our next study session for what we did last time. We're also going to look at any questions that maybe we got right, but we shouldn't have gotten them right? It was a guess or something like that. We're going to do a review. Just make sure we are solid there. Then maybe we can be done for the day. So often that's going to take a little bit longer. That might be more in the range of like 45 minutes to an hour. You do not have to do this every day. I typically don't recommend studying every day. I typically recommend taking at least one day a week off, just to kind of maintain your mental health and your well-being. Burnout's real, especially with everything that's going on, and the fact that you guys are in school as well and have lives as well. So I was very busy around my junior year. So for those of you who are in your junior or senior years, totally empathize, or even sophomore years. Those are tough times. So you do not need to be studying every day. You do not need to be putting in 4 hours of study every day. Don't do that. If you are studying and you're going, wow, this is not a great study session, I'm not focused, I can't wrap my head around this, I'm missing questions that I shouldn't be, maybe try a different type of question or just be done. Just be done for the day, come back another time, give yourself a break. Doing less doing less study, but making sure your study is high quality is better than doing more medium quality study. In fact, doing study that's not so great can lead to building bad habits. So all of this to say, some study sessions will be shorter. Less than 20 minutes probably isn't going to do much for you. 20 minutes is probably like just reviewing previous problems, just doing similar problems to the previous day and trying not to make the same mistakes. But like a full length, high quality study session with all the normal pieces is probably going to be 45 minutes to an hour, maybe a little longer. And if you're taking a practice test, which you're probably doing every 2 to 4 weeks, maybe you're even doing it tomorrow, right? But at some point before your test, that's going to be a lot longer because you're going to be taking your practice test. You also want to review it. Maybe that might be the day after, but typically review is going to take at least an hour. So it depends. It really depends. You're going to have to flex it a little bit, but I would recommend setting aside, say, an hour on at least 4 days out of the week for like really high quality study. If you're in the position where you had a previous test date and it got canceled, you might be doing a little bit less study because you might just be doing maintenance. If you are in a position where you need a little bit more progress before your test date, you might be doing more than 4 days, maybe like 5, 6 days. And you might be doing slightly longer study sessions, but don't make them so long that they're low quality. Make sure that your study is high quality at the end of the day. That's the thing that matters the most. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. And I think that's it. Okay, thank you so much for being here, you guys. This is a really great cram session. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. If you have additional questions, again, feel free to throw those in the comments on this video or ask our student help team if you have a Magoosh account. And if you haven't taken a practice test yet, please take this opportunity to do so. It is a really, really valuable experience before your testing. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you guys later.